The burning steel! The M1 carbine had stopped trembling in Audie Murphy's hands by the time he spotted the German armor moving through the tree line. 300 yards across the snow-covered clearing, dark shapes emerged between the frost-covered pines of the Vosges Mountains, like mechanical predators testing the morning air. January 1945 had brought the kind of bitter cold that made metal burn against bare skin, and now Murphy watched through his breath fog as enemy tanks positioned themselves for what looked like a coordinated assault on his company's overextended line. The burning tank destroyer behind him sent up a column of black smoke that could be seen for miles across the eastern French countryside. What had been their primary anti-tank support 30 minutes ago was now a beacon, announcing their vulnerability to every German artillery spotter in the region. The TD's crew had bailed out after taking a direct hit from a Panzerfaust, leaving Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment with nothing heavier than bazookas and small arms to face what appeared to be at least a company of enemy armor. Murphy crouched behind the stone wall of a bombed-out farmhouse that sat on a slight rise overlooking the approach routes from the German positions. His squad had been tasked with holding this sector while the main force regrouped after 3 brutal days of house-to-house fighting in the villages below. What should have been a routine defensive position had become a nightmare when intelligence reports proved wrong about enemy strength in the Vosges forests. Instead of scattered resistance from retreating units, they now faced what looked like a deliberate counterattack designed to cut off American advances. Staff Sergeant Manning lay wounded behind the farmhouse's collapsed kitchen wall, his face grey with shock and blood loss. The platoon leader had caught shrapnel from the same round that destroyed their tank destroyer, leaving Murphy as the senior NCO for what remained of their defensive position. Private Torres kept checking his ammunition and looking back toward the village where safety lay, assuming they could reach it alive. The newer replacements, boys who had arrived just weeks ago with clean uniforms and stateside optimism, watched Murphy with expressions that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. "Sir, we got movement all along that tree line," Torres said, his voice carrying the tight control of a man trying not to sound scared. "Looks like they're bringing up more than we can handle." Murphy raised his binoculars and counted the enemy vehicles systematically. 2 Panzerfouls, at least 1 assault gun, and what appeared to be a self-propelled artillery piece positioning itself for indirect fire support. Behind the armor, grey uniformed infantry moved with the disciplined spacing of veteran troops. These weren't the old men and teenagers that Wehrmacht units had been fielding in recent weeks. These soldiers advanced with tactical awareness and coordinated fire discipline. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate calls for reinforcements, but division headquarters could only promise support as soon as possible. Military speak that usually translated to hours or days, not the minutes they actually had before the German assault reached their position. Murphy checked his remaining magazines and counted 42 rounds between him and whatever came next. The weapon that had shaken with nervous energy during the morning briefing now felt steady in his hands, as if some part of him had accepted what was coming. Through the morning haze, he could see German soldiers advancing in small groups, using the stone walls and farm equipment scattered across the field for cover. They moved with purpose, covering each other's movement, while their armor provided overwatch from the forest edge. Murphy selected his first target carefully, knowing that every shot would have to count once the real fighting started. The smart tactical move would be to fall back to the secondary position near the village outskirts, but that would mean abandoning Manning and any other wounded who couldn't be moved quickly enough. "Murphy," Torres whispered, "what are we gonna do?" The question hung in the cold air between them like breath fog. Murphy understood that his answer would determine whether these men lived or died in the next hour. He looked at the burning tank destroyer, its deck guns still intact despite the damage to the vehicle itself, and felt something shift in his thinking. The tremor in his hands disappeared entirely as he made a decision that would haunt his dreams for decades. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The first German mortar rounds began falling at 0847 hours, walking across the farmhouse position with methodical precision. Murphy pressed himself against the stone wall as fragments whistled overhead, feeling the concussions through the frozen earth. The enemy had found their range quickly, too quickly for comfort. Someone with binoculars and good fieldcraft was adjusting fire from the tree line, probably from one of those Panzer I-4s he'd spotted earlier. Private Richardson, one of the replacements who'd arrived from the States just 3 weeks ago, scrambled across the courtyard toward Murphy's position with a message from the company command post. The kid's helmet was too large for his head, giving him the appearance of a child playing soldier until you saw his eyes. Combat in the Vosges Mountains had aged him years in a matter of days. "Lieutenant Sanders says we're supposed to hold until 1100 hours, Richardson panted, diving into cover as another mortar round impacted near the barn. "Says reinforcements are moving up from the village." Murphy checked his watch. 0852. 2 hours and 10 minutes to hold a position that should have been abandoned an hour ago. He looked across the field, where German infantry continued their careful advance, now within 200 yards of the farmhouse perimeter. Behind them, the armor was moving into direct fire positions, their main guns traversing toward targets along the American defensive line. The burning tank destroyer continued to send up its column of smoke, but Murphy had noticed something during the mortar barrage. The vehicle's hull was gutted, but the turret appeared intact. More importantly, the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the commander's cupola looked undamaged. If a man could reach it, and if the ammunition hadn't cooked off in the fire, that weapon might change the tactical equation significantly. Torres crawled over from his position near the barn, his rifle cradled carefully to keep snow out of the action. "Murphy, I've been watching those Krauts, and they're setting up for a coordinated assault. See how they got that assault gun positioned to cover the left approach? Soon as they start moving, we're going to be in a world of hurt." Murphy nodded, still studying the burning TD through his binoculars. The vehicle sat at the intersection of 2 farm roads, perhaps 50 yards from the farmhouse, but completely exposed to enemy observation. Reaching it would require crossing open ground under direct fire from multiple weapons. The smart money said it was suicide. The desperate money said it might be their only chance. Staff Sergeant Manning stirred behind the kitchen wall, his voice weak but coherent. "Murphy, you got to get these boys out of here. This position can't be held." The wounded platoon leader was right from a tactical standpoint. Company B was facing overwhelming odds with inadequate support and no reasonable expectation of successful reinforcement. Standard doctrine called for a fighting withdrawal to prepared positions, preserving combat strength for future operations. But Murphy had learned something during his months in the Vosges Mountains. Sometimes doctrine didn't account for the human cost of tactical decisions. Richardson crouched beside Murphy, his young face tight with concentration as he tried to count enemy soldiers across the field. "How many you figure we're facing?" "Too many," Murphy replied quietly. "But that don't change what we got to do." The German advance paused as their forward elements reached a drainage ditch about 150 yards from the farmhouse. Murphy could see helmets and rifle barrels as enemy soldiers prepared for their final assault. In a few minutes, they would come fast and hard, probably supported by direct fire from those panzers. When they did, the thin American line would crumble quickly unless something changed the momentum. Murphy made his decision with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through Sicily, Anzio, and southern France. He handed his carbine to Torres and began stripping off his heavy overcoat. The morning air bit through his wool shirt, but he would need mobility more than warmth for what came next. "Where you going?" Torres asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Murphy nodded toward the burning tank destroyer. "Gonna see if that .50 still works." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of German armor and the occasional crack of small arms fire from other sectors. Richardson stared at the burning vehicle, then back at Murphy, his mouth slightly open. Torres just shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man watching a friend make an impossible choice. "That's suicide," Torres said finally. "Maybe," Murphy replied, checking his .45 pistol and slipping an extra magazine into his pocket. "But staying here sure as hell is." The radio crackled with fragmentary reports from adjacent units along the 3rd Infantry Division's extended line in the Vosges Mountains. 2nd Battalion was taking heavy casualties near Reipertswiller. 1st Battalion had lost contact with 2 of its companies. Artillery support remained limited due to ammunition shortages and the difficulty of moving guns through the snow-choked forest roads that connected their positions to the rear supply areas. Murphy listened to the tactical picture developing over the airwaves while he prepared for his dash to the burning tank destroyer. Each report confirmed what he could see with his own eyes. Company B was part of a larger German offensive designed to exploit American overextension in this sector. Higher command had spread their forces too thin across the winter landscape, betting that enemy units were too weakened for major operations. That bet was proving wrong. Private Kerrigan, the company radio operator, crawled over from the command post with his SCR 300 strapped to his back and fear written across his face. The kid had been steady under fire for weeks, but something in the radio traffic had shaken him badly. Murphy could guess what. The calls for reinforcement were being answered with promises instead of movement orders. "Lieutenant Sanders wants to know your assessment of the situation," Kerrigan said, though his voice suggested he was asking for himself as much as for the officer. "Says to tell him if you think we can hold until the armor gets here." Murphy looked across the field where German infantry was massing in the drainage ditch, then at the burning TD with its potentially functional machine gun. The honest answer was that they had perhaps 10 minutes before being overrun. The optimistic answer was that miracles sometimes happened when good soldiers refused to quit. The answer he gave was somewhere between truth and hope. "Tell the lieutenant we'll hold," Murphy said quietly. "Tell him to get those wounded evacuated and be ready to move the CP if things go bad." Kerrigan nodded and began speaking into his handset, his words barely audible over the increasing tempo of enemy small arms fire. Murphy could hear the sharp crack of German rifles and the deeper chatter of MG-42 machine guns as enemy soldiers tested the American defensive line. Soon, that probing fire would become suppressive fire, pinning down Murphy's squad while assault troops closed the distance. Torres had been watching the German preparations through a gap in the stone wall. "They're getting ready to come," he announced. "See that officer with the binoculars? He's been pointing at our position for the last 5 minutes." Murphy nodded and began his final preparations. He removed his cartridge belt and handed it to Richardson, keeping only his pistol and 2 spare magazines. The less weight he carried, the faster he could move across that 50 yards of open ground, assuming he made it at all. The burning tank destroyer continued to send up its beacon of black smoke, but Murphy had studied the vehicle carefully during the enemy mortar barrage. The fire appeared to be confined to the engine compartment and crew areas. The turret and commander's position might still be accessible if a man could reach them before German riflemen cut him down. It was a gamble with odds that no sane person would accept. Staff Sergeant Manning had been watching Murphy's preparations with growing understanding. The wounded NCO struggled to sit up against the kitchen wall, his face grey with blood loss, but his eyes still sharp with tactical awareness. "Son," Manning said quietly, "you don't have to do this. We can fall back to the secondary position." "And leave you here?" Murphy replied. "Not happening, Sergeant." The moral weight of that exchange settled over the small group like winter fog. Every man present understood the mathematics of their situation. A fighting withdrawal might save most of the squad, but it would certainly doom Manning and any other wounded who couldn't move quickly. Murphy was choosing between tactical wisdom and a loyalty that transcended military doctrine. Richardson checked his rifle action nervously, the metallic sounds sharp in the cold air. "What do you want us to do while you're out there?" "Keep their heads down," Murphy said. "Soon as I start moving, pour everything you got into that ditch. Make them think about something besides shooting at me." The German assault began at 0917 hours with a crescendo of mortar fire that walked across the farmhouse position like thunder. Murphy pressed himself against the stone wall and felt the concussions through his bones, tasting cordite and dust in the air. When the barrage lifted, he could hear enemy soldiers shouting commands in German as they prepared for their final rush. Torres gripped Murphy's shoulder briefly. "See you on the other side." Murphy nodded and gathered himself for the sprint that would either change everything or end everything. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of approaching armor, though whether German or American remained unclear. What was certain was that the next few minutes would determine whether Company B held its position or ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. The question that haunted every soldier in that moment was simple. How do you measure the value of impossible courage against the mathematics of survival? Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy broke from cover at 0920 hours, sprinting across the snow-covered field toward the burning tank destroyer as German rifles opened up from the drainage ditch. The first shots snapped overhead with the distinctive crack of near misses, followed by the heavier hammering of a machine gun that sent up geysers of frozen earth around his boots. Behind him, Torres and Richardson poured suppressive fire into the enemy positions, their rifles barking rapidly as they tried to spoil German aim. The 50 yards to the tank destroyer felt like 50 miles under fire. Murphy ran in a zigzag pattern, changing direction every few steps as bullets whined past his head and shoulders. A round tugged at his shirt sleeve. Another kicked up snow inches from his right foot. The mathematical certainty that he should be dead by now gave way to a strange sense of clarity, as if the universe had narrowed to just this moment, this distance, this burning vehicle ahead. He reached the TD and dove behind its armored hull as a burst of machine gun fire sparked off the metal above his head. The vehicle was indeed gutted by fire, its crew compartment blackened and filled with acrid smoke, but the turret structure appeared intact. More importantly, the commander's cupola and its 50 caliber machine gun showed no obvious damage. Murphy could hear German voices shouting orders as enemy soldiers prepared for their assault, knowing that American resistance had been weakened by his absence from the farmhouse position. The climb onto the burning tank destroyer was like ascending into hell. Heat radiated from the hull plates, and smoke stung his eyes as he pulled himself up toward the commander's position. The metal burned his hands even through his gloves, but Murphy forced himself to ignore the pain as he settled behind the machine gun and checked its condition. The weapon appeared functional, with a full belt of ammunition still in place. Through the smoke and heat shimmer, Murphy could see German infantry beginning their final assault. Grey figures emerged from the drainage ditch in small groups, advancing by bounds while their machine guns provided covering fire. Behind them, the Panzer IVs were moving into direct fire positions, their main guns already traversing toward the farmhouse where Murphy's squad continued their desperate defense. The 50 caliber machine gun came alive in Murphy's hands like a thing possessed. His first burst caught a group of advancing Germans in the open, the heavy rounds dropping them immediately and sending their comrades scrambling for whatever cover they could find. The weapon's deep hammering echoed across the field, announcing that the tactical equation had suddenly changed. What had seemed like an inevitable German victory was now a deadly crossfire. Murphy traversed the gun toward the enemy armor, knowing that the 50 caliber couldn't penetrate tank armor, but hoping to suppress the crews and disrupt their coordination. His rounds sparked off the lead Panzer's turret, forcing the commander to button up and limiting his visibility. The assault gun that had been positioning for a direct shot at the farmhouse suddenly turned its attention toward the burning TD, its main gun swinging toward Murphy's position. The duel that followed lasted perhaps 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Murphy fired burst after burst into the German infantry positions, forcing them to ground and breaking up their coordinated advance. Enemy machine gunners tried to suppress his position, but couldn't maintain accurate fire against a target surrounded by smoke and heat shimmer. The assault gun fired twice, both rounds missing by yards as its crew struggled to get a clean sight picture. From his elevated position, Murphy could see the entire battlefield with devastating clarity. German soldiers, who had seemed invisible from ground level, were now exposed targets as they tried to maneuver across the open field. He picked his targets methodically. Machine gun crews, officers with radios, soldiers carrying Panzerfausts that threatened the American position. The 50 caliber rounds struck with terrible finality, each burst changing the momentum of the engagement. The German assault broke not because of casualties, Murphy's unit was still vastly outnumbered, but because of confusion and disrupted coordination. Enemy commanders had planned their attack around suppressing known American positions, but now faced devastating fire from an unexpected direction. Radio intercepts later revealed that German officers spent crucial minutes trying to understand how their intelligence could have been so wrong about American strength and positioning. Torres, watching from the farmhouse, would later describe the sight as both inspiring and terrifying. Murphy seemed to be everywhere at once on the burning vehicle, firing from different positions as he worked the machine gun with deadly precision. The tank destroyer continued to burn around him, but he appeared oblivious to the heat and smoke, focused entirely on the systematic destruction of the German assault. The enemy withdrawal began in small groups, soldiers falling back to the tree line under cover of smoke and suppressive fire from their own machine guns. The Panzers provided covering fire as they too pulled back, their crews apparently unwilling to face the devastating crossfire that had developed. Within 20 minutes, the field that had been full of advancing German infantry was empty except for scattered equipment and the evidence of a hasty retreat. Murphy remained on the burning tank destroyer until the last enemy soldier disappeared into the forest, the .50 caliber silent in his hands as he surveyed the battlefield, through eyes that seemed older than his 20 years. The weapon that had been his lifeline for those crucial minutes now felt impossibly heavy, and the heat from the burning vehicle finally penetrated his consciousness. He climbed down slowly, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from delayed reaction to what he had just accomplished. The silence that followed the German withdrawal was broken only by the crackling of flames from the tank destroyer and the distant sound of enemy vehicles retreating through the Vosges Mountains forest. Murphy sat on the ground beside the burning TD, his back against the armored hull that had been his salvation and nearly his crematorium. His hands trembled as the adrenaline finally began to fade, and for the first time since the action began, he allowed himself to think about how close he had come to dying. Torres was the first to reach him, running across the field that minutes before had been swept by machine gun fire. The private's face showed a mixture of relief, admiration, and something that might have been fear, not of the enemy, but of what he had just witnessed from a 20-year-old soldier who had single-handedly broken a coordinated assault by veteran troops. "Jesus Christ, Murphy," Torres said quietly, kneeling beside him. "I thought for sure you were dead when that assault gun started shooting. How the hell did you survive up there?" Murphy looked at his hands, noting the burns on his palms where he had gripped the hot metal of the machine gun. The pain was starting to register now, along with a dozen other small injuries he hadn't noticed during the firefight. His shirt was torn in several places where bullets had passed close enough to snag the fabric, and his face was blackened with smoke and cordite residue. "I don't know," he answered honestly. I just kept firing until they went away. The truth was more complicated than that simple statement. For those crucial minutes on the burning tank destroyer, Murphy had experienced something that he would never be able to explain adequately to anyone, including himself. The fear that had plagued him all morning had disappeared, replaced by a clarity of purpose that felt almost supernatural. Every target had seemed perfectly clear, every burst perfectly timed, every movement perfectly coordinated with some larger tactical plan that existed only in his mind. Richardson and Kerrigan arrived with a litter for Staff Sergeant Manning, who was finally getting the medical evacuation that his wounds required. The wounded NCO looked at Murphy with an expression that mixed pride and concern, understanding better than the younger soldiers what kind of psychological toll such actions could exact on a man. Manning had seen soldiers break under the weight of their own heroism, unable to reconcile what they had done with who they thought they were. "That was well done, son," Manning said as they loaded him onto the litter. "But don't let it eat at you. What you did today saved a lot of lives." Murphy nodded, but he was already beginning to understand that Manning's warning had come too late. The action was over, but his mind continued to replay every detail with perfect clarity. The faces of German soldiers in his sights, the mechanical rhythm of the machine gun, the moment when he realized that men were dying because of his decisions. The official reports would call it a gallant defense against overwhelming odds, but Murphy would remember it as the day he became someone else entirely. Lieutenant Sanders arrived with a reconnaissance patrol from the company command post, his face showing the relief of an officer whose worst tactical fears had not been realized. The lieutenant surveyed the battlefield with the eye of someone who would have to write an after-action report, explaining how a single soldier had accomplished what should have been impossible. "Murphy, I need to understand exactly what happened here," Sanders said, pulling out a field notebook. "Division is going to want details about enemy strength, casualties, weapons captured, the whole picture." As Murphy began his account, he realized that the official version would necessarily be different from his lived experience. The report would describe tactical positions, fields of fire, and enemy movements. It couldn't capture the smell of burning metal and cordite, the weight of the machine gun in his hands, or the moment when fear became focus and uncertainty became deadly precision. The citation that would eventually result from this action would reduce those minutes to clean sentences about gallantry and devotion to duty. Kerrigan had been monitoring radio traffic during the evacuation, and his face showed concern as he approached Lieutenant Sanders. "Sir, I've been listening to Division Net, and it sounds like the Krauts hit us pretty hard all along the line. 2nd Battalion took heavy casualties, and 1st Battalion is still out of contact with 2 companies." The larger tactical picture was beginning to emerge, and it wasn't encouraging. The German offensive had achieved significant success in several sectors, exploiting exactly the kind of overextension that had made Company B's position so vulnerable. Murphy's stand at the farmhouse had been one small bright spot in what was shaping up to be a difficult day for American forces in the Vosges Mountains. Torres helped Murphy to his feet, steadying him as they prepared to move back to the farmhouse position. "You need to see a medic about those hands," he said, noting the burns and cuts that Murphy hadn't bothered to mention. "I'm fine," Murphy replied automatically, though he was beginning to understand that fine might not be an accurate description of his condition. The physical injuries would heal quickly enough, but something else had changed during those minutes on the burning tank destroyer. He felt disconnected from himself, as if he was watching someone else's memories of the action. The walk back to the farmhouse took them across the field where German soldiers had advanced just an hour earlier. Scattered equipment and weapons marked the path of their retreat, testimony to the sudden violence that had disrupted their careful assault. Murphy picked up a German rifle and examined it briefly, noting the quality of its manufacture and the care with which its previous owner had maintained it. That soldier was probably someone's son, someone's brother, Someone who had been following orders, just as Murphy had been following his. The weight of that realization would stay with him long after the war ended, part of the invisible burden that came with actions that looked heroic from a distance but felt like necessity up close. The official citation would mention his conspicuous gallantry and selfless devotion to duty, but it wouldn't mention the dreams that would follow, or the way certain sounds and smells would bring him back to this moment for the rest of his life. The reinforcements arrived 2 hours later, a column of tanks from the 761st Tank Battalion rumbling through the snow-covered farmland with the authority of American industrial might. Murphy watched them deploy across the field where he had faced German armor, with nothing but a .50 caliber machine gun and whatever courage he could summon. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead it left him feeling oddly empty, as if the crisis that had defined him so completely was now being erased by routine military procedure. Major Harrison from Division Headquarters arrived with the relief force, his staff car following the tanks like a bureaucratic shadow. The Major's job was to collect information for higher command, to transform the messy reality of small unit combat into the clean language of operational summaries. Murphy found himself answering questions about fields of fire and enemy strength, while part of his mind remained fixed on the memory of burning metal and the weight of decisions that no training manual could have prepared him for. "Son," the Major said, closing his notebook after 20 minutes of detailed questions, "what you did here today is going to be talked about for a long time. Division is recommending you for the Medal of Honor." Murphy nodded politely, but the words felt disconnected from his experience of the morning. The action hadn't felt heroic while he was living it, just necessary, urgent, and terrifyingly immediate. The idea that it would become a story, a citation, a piece of official history, seemed to diminish rather than honor what had actually happened. The real weight of the day wasn't in its strategic significance, but in its psychological cost. Torres sat beside Murphy on the farmhouse steps as evening approached, both men cleaning their weapons with the automatic motions of soldiers who had learned that maintenance was survival. The private had been unusually quiet since the afternoon, processing what he had witnessed in his own way. Finally, he spoke the question that had been bothering him for hours. "Murphy, how do you do something like that and then just go on? Like it was just another day?" The question cut deeper than Torres probably intended. Murphy understood that his friend was really asking about the nature of courage itself, whether it was something you possessed or something that possessed you, whether it could be summoned at will or arrived like lightning, unpredictable and transforming. The honest answer was that Murphy didn't know how to go on, only that going on was the next thing required of him. "I don't know," Murphy said quietly. "I guess you just do the next thing that needs doing." Richardson had been writing a letter home, his young face serious in the lantern light that spilled from the farmhouse kitchen. The replacement had aged years in a single day, his innocence burned away by the proximity of death and the witness of impossible courage. When he finished the letter, he folded it carefully and looked at Murphy with something approaching awe. "My dad always said there were men who could do things that regular people couldn't," Richardson said. "I never believed him until today." Murphy felt uncomfortable with the reverence in the kid's voice. What he had done felt less like transcendence and more like desperation, less like heroism and more like the absence of alternatives. The German assault had to be stopped, and he had been in position to stop it. The mathematics of survival had demanded action, and he had acted. Everything else, the citations, the stories, the transformation into legend, was something that other people would create from the raw material of necessity. Staff Sergeant Manning had been evacuated to the division aid station, but before leaving, he had pulled Murphy aside for a private conversation that would echo in the young soldier's mind for decades. The wounded NCO's words had been simple but prophetic. Son, what you did today is going to follow you for the rest of your life. Don't let it become bigger than you are. Now, as darkness fell over the Vosges Mountains and the day's action receded into memory, Murphy began to understand what Manning had meant. The story of his stand on the burning tank destroyer would be told and retold, gaining momentum with each telling until it bore only passing resemblance to his lived experience. He would become a symbol, a representation of American courage and determination, but the price of that transformation would be the loss of his own agency in defining what had happened. Lieutenant Sanders finished his after-action report as the last light faded from the western sky. The document would work its way up the chain of command through battalion and regiment and division until it reached the desks of men who had never heard small arms fire in anger. Those officers would read about gallant defense and conspicuous valor, and they would check boxes on forms that reduced human complexity to administrative categories. But the real aftermath of the action would be measured in smaller, more personal terms, the way Murphy's hands would shake sometimes when he heard certain sounds, the dreams that would wake him decades later with the smell of burning metal in his nostrils, the weight of carrying stories that could never be fully told because the telling would require explaining what it felt like to become someone else in moments of extremity. Torres broke the evening silence with an observation that captured something essential about their shared experience. You know what's funny? Tomorrow morning, we're gonna get up and do this all over again. Like it was just another day in the war. Murphy nodded, understanding that Torres had identified the central paradox of combat. Extraordinary moments embedded in the routine of survival, heroism that felt like work, legend-making that looked from the inside like doing what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. Years later, when reporters would ask Murphy about his Medal of Honor action in the Vosges Mountains, he would struggle to explain the disconnect between public recognition and private memory. The citation would speak of indomitable courage and selfless devotion, but Murphy would remember the simpler truth, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, and that the real weight of heroism wasn't in its celebration, but in its aftermath, when ordinary men had to live with the knowledge of what they had been capable of when everything else fell away. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.